Okay, business. So that's what my degree is in. So I love the business, actually the business of fashion, the making money of fashion. I love that part. I love the entrepreneurial aspect of fashion, and that's what we're going to be talking about in this chapter. Now, in this section of the lecture, however, we are just going to be talking about the scope of the fashion business. So we're just going to be laying the groundwork. We've already talked about the economics in the previous chapter, so we're only going to spend one slide on that, but we're going to talk about the scope of fashion. We're going to talk a little bit about the diversity and competition, and we're going to talk about some legal aspects of business. Sorry, of the business of fashion. Okay, so I'm not going to belabor this point because we had a whole lecture on the importance of the fashion industry. So what I'm just going to talk about is, again, I'm just going to reiterate what we know, that fashion is highly sophisticated. It's a $2.5 trillion global industry, and U.S. consumers alone spend $380 billion, about $380 billion on apparel and footwear. And it encompasses a whole bunch of industries within the industry, and that's what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about that's what we're talking about in this lecture. We're talking about the industries that all work together that keep us as consumers satisfied. What do we mean when we say scope, the scope of the fashion business? So the scope just really is all those interlocking building blocks, all the interlocking pieces that make up what the business actually is. And there's four levels. One is very easy. The retail level is very easy for you to understand. But what we're going to do is we're going to dig in on the next slide what the other components make up. But first, we'll talk about on this slide. We'll talk about the primary level. And the primary level, if you take textiles, you'll learn a lot about the primary level. And the primary level is just the raw materials that make up the fashion business. So I say that for textiles because we talk about fibers and yarns and what are known as grayish goods that are unfinished. So that's the ground level. That's the foundation, right? You can't make anything unless you have some raw materials. So the primary level is just the raw materials of the items that are sold in the fashion industry. In the next slide, we'll talk about the other three levels. These other three levels you're definitely more familiar with, right? So you probably never thought about, the farms and the fiber producers, where the fibers come from, or the yarns, the grayish goods, which are just those unfinished goods. You probably never thought about those, but these other levels you definitely know. So the secondary level are just the creators, right? So the people who take who take the raw goods that are from the primary level, and they turn them into something, and they turn them into textiles that then become garments. They are the designers, because the designers could be designers of prints and fabrics, but they could also be designers of finished products, right? And then, of course, the designer makes something, they send it to a factory or manufacturer to do that piece. Then in that mix, we have the wholesalers and the vendors that work in partnership with the designers and manufacturers to get those items into our stores. And on the retail level, we know those, right? We know all of these retail items, retail levels. You may not know a couple of things in there. Sorry, I just coughed. You may not know a couple of things in there, but category killers and that kind of stuff. But department stores, especially stores, chain stores, we know all these, right? You can name one of all of these things, right? So the retail level is very much self-explanatory. We're going to talk about some retail level jobs when we get to our careers in this one. And the auxiliary is special because the auxiliary touches all of the other three levels, right? So primary, secondary, retail could be called tertiary, a third level, but the auxiliary level touches all of those other areas. So these are people that do, product development, and we've talked about fashion forecasters, right? We've talked about buyers, merchandisers. We talked a little bit about, stylists and event planners, advertisers. Those are some of the things that we've already talked about. So those are the things that all make up that scope of the business, right? So primary is raw materials, secondary is the person that takes the raw materials, transforms it into something else, and then the last thing is how the thing gets to the consumer. So if we look at our arrows, right, everything, each step of the top level of the blue goes down to the consumer. However, without that yellow level, without the auxiliary level, it wouldn't get to the consumer in the same manner. So here's some of the business stuff, right? What are businesses in? What are the why are they? What's the purpose of a business? The purpose of a business is to make money, and that's the purpose of businesses in fashion as well, is to make money. And they do that in different manners and different types of retailers. We'll talk about that later in the lecture. Different types of retailers have a different theme, focus on how they make that money. So that's what we mean when we talk about diversity in the fashion business. So diversity just means that there's a mix, right? There's a mix of retailers and organizations that do the same thing, right? But they may do it in a slightly different manner in order to reach their end goal, and the end goal is to make money, right? So let's look at the image that we have on the screen, right? So we have three trench coats, right? And I didn't intentionally, they have no brands on them, but we have three trench coats, and for some companies, the motto was good, better, best, right? So for a company like Macy's, they would sell all three of these trench coats. They would just sell them at different price points, right? So they would sell, maybe the one on the end is a Burberry coat that they would sell on the high end, and then the one in the middle is a Kenneth Cole, and the one on the very end is like Rampage, right? So that competition, some businesses compete based on price, right? So their goal is to either be really high end and luxurious, or to be middle of the road, or to be accessible to all. That's the correct way for me to say cheap, right? And then some companies, their whole thing is to have the best quality, right? So there's such a high quality brand that it allows for the price to be that high. So when I worked for Ralph, Ralph sells really expensive cashmere sweaters. They're actually, I don't know what they are now. They were $4.95 when I worked there. Cashmere sweaters are $4.95, but Ralph, with Ralph, we could tell you exactly what farm that cashmere sheep was raised on, right? Because they were very focused on having high quality products. So they wanted to make sure they had the highest quality sheep. That it came from, right? And then the last thing is competition and innovation, right? So having the fastest, newest, freshest thing. So having, some kind of specialty in fabric. So your fabric is the most innovative, your styling is the most innovative, your fit is the most innovative. You're upcycled, or you're recycled, or you're using, ends of fabric that have just been like sitting in a factory. So when we talk about diversity in fashion, that's what we talk about. We talk about, diversity in pricing with the same kind of items, diversity in quality, and diversity in innovation. So in any business, there's always some regulation, and there's regulations for fashion, believe it or not. So the table that's listed here, there's a version of it on page 82 of your textbook. I'm also going to include this underneath this portion of the lecture. But there are a couple of acts that are really important. Now, inside words, there's only a couple here, but there's some that I want to point out. So, and many of them aren't new. And first is the Sherman Act, the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890, and you probably have heard that there's a law that prevents monopolies, and that's what it is, right? The Sherman of 1890 is over 100 years old. it outlawed restricting competition. And in retail fashion, there's not as many monopolies, at least in retail fashion. Other areas of retail, there are some areas where there are just one or two players, but for the fashion part, this isn't as big of an issue. However, the Sherman Antitrust Act does affect a lot of the manufacturers, right? So folks keep buying up so that they kind of control an industry. The other thing is the Clayton Act of 1914, which is really important because it established that companies couldn't work together to fix the price of an item, so of a garment. So, Macy's and JCPenney's can't meet and say this is what the price of an item is going to be. However, they can't meet and say that, but oftentimes what happens is that they mirror each other in the price. So one person sets a price or has a promotion, and then another company follows along and does the same thing. So technically that's not price fixing, but it's a slick way to get around it. And then some of the other acts that are really important is the Flammable Fabrics Act. So companies can't have flammable fabrics for apparel. So that's why you see the little note when you go into a fabric store, like, this is not suitable for children's for children's pajamas, because it's probably flammable. That's part of it. And also the Textiles Fiber and Identification Act, which was first established in 1960 and then amended, and it just says that producers have to tell us what the fiber content is of our garments. So they can't falsify. They can't say it's 100% cotton if it's 94% cotton and 6% something else. And then finally, the Fair Packaging and Labeling Act, which again for interstate and foreign producers to explain what something is made out of. So again, that just extends to products that are brought into the country, that they have to tell us what they're made of and their country of origin.